这真不做的你没讲，我们不能真不人家讲了，到个当工长多些嘛的，东巴的这将来给上词光中讲呢，我讲三比相呢，上就三会上几几相的，上就多比上几几相的，相的这我三吧。真着就这样点着，就这只打了好比300万点年多，好比300只年把你不300万点年多，你不300只年把100样点年多，100只年把用数5万点年多，用数5万只，他们那么讲点年多，他们那么只，他们那只年把用数100样点年多，用数100。只打人的sentient用数100样对不上了，sentient用数100只打人的意思用数100样对不上。이시 용수 떡바 쩌다 전도 담바 용수 떡바용 대전 담바 용수 떡바 전도 이시 주바 용수 떡바용 대전 이시 주바 용수 떡바 전도 랑거 셈 용수 떡바용 대전데 리기베 때다웨나 상주 생활 산지 지종 용수 떡브르시 반도베 랑거 셈 용수 장와라 난담 샤오 티지지르제나 쩌다 상주 생활 셈 용수 떡바 텐자와 산지 지정 용수 떡바는 겨로 때네 산지 짐티 세단 담바 샤리베 란드 냠드 셈테강 지르다가 심 용수 떡바 텐자와 상주 생활 산지 지정 용수 떡바는 겨나 좀든데 식자다 바 상주 생활 쇼바나 대심 용수 마덕금 지네 산지 지정 들다와 용수 마덕바 나오냐 못에니 좀든데 지 세단 담바 샤리 심 용수 떡바 티짐켄니 세단 담바 샤리베 란드 그치 꽉사도 샤리베 즉 냠도 셈 니마다 다와 용스 더금 진이 밀롱거 밀롱 더금 맘통 소라 좀든데 때터 말락소 되노 밀롱 더금 농지 니마다 다위는 마윤 만농 까츠바 샤리베 대전도 셈전 남레 대전 쇼비 산지지 정거 용도 지 고바 맘통와 되는 셈전 남지 무시비 니저 데라 대전 쇼비 니바 마윤노 샤리베 대 대전 쇼비 산지지 장의 용수 더 모치 교지 때터 맘통 때네 참 라라전지 참바 라라전지 네튼 샤리벨란드르케지 메소 좀바 샤리베 대전 쇼비 산지지 장 용수 마토고지 마즈르지 좀바 샤리베 좀든데지 산지지 장 용수 더 반더스타테 회나 좀바 샤리베 잔 저왕시지 하르남경네 집고바 쩌다 전도 좀든데 식게다 산지지 장 고바 코이양 딘저름 통오 되니 네튼 샤리베 참바 라라잔란드르케지 메소 참바 코는 사진본도 동문당 체르마당 양사당 리제모당 남쪽당 징금지 랍더 강으름 통오 참바 라라잔지 메바 드르터 산지지장 드르터 산지지장 온서 마도반 통하는 좀바 샤리베 통문 요장 좀바 샤리베 셈람 통문 요장 산지지 23배 용서 마도버랑 인소 강덕 좀바샤리베 셈진 탐칠라 심냠자 산지지 이시라 삼바 용서 떡베 때다가 산지지 장도 더 용서 떡밤 통오 되니 좀든지 통숨지 통진본 직든지 감달라 잡지 태운금 난데 태움 난데 흔마덕든 직든지 감들 름보치 땀이 썩바다 름보치 야통땀이 쏙떡 rimbochi gyastung tuma suzur kupar kirwa ndartarte khwena tevjang shaba rimbochi kopi jiktingi kam yonda rinchen thayib kopa janda jiktingi kamda dedang jago teni tamchatang dambing khur dedang ngomsar da jirjang dagni kyang rimbochi pamma kopi irtanla ndigtag nyam rimbochi pamma kopi irtanla ndigba nyam shedo teni chondende ji tsedang damba shariwa labka sarwa shariwa choki 상지지 정거 용담 고반담 통하마 소라 좀던데 통하라서 흥은 맘통과 마투지 고반더스타고 다고 꽉자와 샤리베 상지지 장다 떡든 든자 모지 샘정 맘바 남라 용서 멤버십이 시르다 대정섭에 상지지 장다 때터 니바 망부 견착버 돈데 샤리벤더스타테 회나 리버 넘버는 보지 노독 찍다 자양 소놈 찌르타브럽 서비 셰프적기 리브 드르시 니버네 바데 전도 샤리브 셈친지 산지지 장치드 제바 따그냥 셈친 찌르터 용서 떡바 전도 산지지 산지 남지 산지지 정거 고밤 통오 산지지 정거 용던지 고반더 나나 쪽쪽 gia che juston la na me pa yang da ba shang chip to ngomber shang chip to sim ke do lan za ba jon kan da le zam ba jon no kum chum jon ne dan han chik de la bar ngab Rngabja po te tag jism tambi zopa tobar kir to te nip chumdin de jir zamchir te tag ftarwa tang te ne yang sanji ji jang te ngunji ramjan te kir to te ne nyantu ji tagba la tang mar namlan daf nyam da sem te kema doshin da tag na martak ko nyam da rigni chukchak samchir nirtung chur namla chuki mirdir me chan chima tang chara tak ko gerlong gyartong na lemba me par Zagba le sim number trolo sanji ji jang chembola mubok chokchok shia gya juston yang chu tamjir number mchri ni gya juston di sanji ji kumbar no chokchok gya juston la na me pa yang do burzo ba shan sim ties da na ya gya juston sanji ji jang chembola mubok chokchok get juston yang chu tam che juba la niver jokum sanya ring lana me pa zo ba shan sim ties
These two terms are identical in the Tibetan text. Are there actually two of them? Are they indeed the same? There should be another one appearing before this, right? The number 84,000. The number 84,000 appears twice, does it not? They seem to be the same. It seems so. I also realize that they appear identical. Is the version you are using from the Kangyur edition, the Derge edition?
Chubar. Rendo. Just no nioka. Yang dober dober shan chip de sim kedo san ji ji jong yong se ta ba lang ji le te tang bo wo.
Yes, it is present there. I see it now. Let us now continue our study of the Vimalakirti Sutra. In our last session, I had some urgent matters to attend to and could not finish the teaching. At that time, I was actually unwilling to stop the class, but there were certain affairs to handle. There were matters concerning Larunga that required me to attend several meetings, so there was no alternative. Apart from such essential matters pertaining to Larungar, I generally would not easily skip a scheduled class. However, a similar situation occurred recently, and it might happen again after a while. I cannot give you a certain schedule right now. Regardless of the circumstances, there will be a class tomorrow. During this week, I will perhaps announce the schedule day by day. This approach is also acceptable. Since some people tend to be rather forgetful, or those who are not especially diligent in seeking the Dharma, they might not always be certain of the time. Sometimes they remember the schedule, and sometimes they do not. This demonstrates that, fundamentally, their aspiration to hear the Dharma is not very strong. In such cases, there is really nothing to be done, is there? So, let us continue with the text below. This is the final class regarding the chapter Buddha Land. Please generate the supreme and excellent bodhicitta to listen to this Mahayana Dharma. When listening to the Mahayana Dharma, you should do so with a joyful heart and with a pure mind. Since today's theme is a pure mind purifies the land, you should set aside all the various afflictions and sufferings and let go of all impure thoughts that might arise while listening. For at least 1 hour, the approximate duration of today's class, during this brief period, listen and receive the teaching with wholehearted attentiveness and genuine earnestness. While you are listening, some points might differ from your usual way of thinking. Should there be any differences, we have access to various commentaries written by great masters. Admittedly, regarding some of these commentaries, I have not had enough time to read every single one. However, I have read portions of them, and they are truly remarkable. The great masters of earlier times were extraordinary, especially the commentaries by Master Kuiji and Master Sengjao. Their works directly address the core teachings of the Vimalakirti Sutra and are excellent. Some people might view the Vimalakirti Sutra primarily as a manual for practice. In that context, within our secret mantrayana, there are many practices focusing on primordial purity, which are very important. Furthermore, within the exoteric traditions as well, we should look at the manner in which our teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, taught the principle that all phenomena are pure. I am sure many of you will understand this point. That is one perspective. Alternatively, there might be some among us here who belong primarily to the academic world. They might be university teachers or researchers. For such individuals, I should mention that I am consulting 3 different versions this time. The first is the version by Kumarajva, the second is the version by Xuanzang, and the third is the version by Wu Zhi Qian. I'm also using the Tibetan text for comparison. Of course, many of the Japanese and English translations were originally translated from these Chinese and Tibetan sources. Nevertheless, they are sometimes quite useful, as those translations are also executed very well. So, during this course, for the scholars and researchers among you, I will provide a symbolic overview of these different versions. I cannot delve into exhaustive detail. If we were to be extremely detailed, we might not finish even in several years. Personally, I am a bit concerned that for myself and for all of you as well, our lives are marked by impermanence. We are all merely passing through this world. No one knows when the time will come to depart. It is best that we bring this task to completion before that time comes. Therefore, I do not dare to prolong the teaching for too long. At the same time, it should not be finished in just 1 or 2 classes. If it were finished so quickly, it would be like a tiger leaping blindly off a cliff. That would simply not be feasible. As you know, we have already conducted several sessions, and today we are only just concluding the first chapter. Thus, even at my fastest pace, or using the most condensed essential pith instruction, conveying the internal structure and reasoning would still be quite challenging. Of course, this serves as an opening gesture and a symbolic introduction for all of you. Even that is very beneficial. So today we continue directly with the chapter, A Pure Mind Purifies the Land. In the previous session, we discussed how for a bodhisattva, the way he will receive and uphold his Buddha land in the future is in fact closely linked to his initial aspirations. This specific point was explained fairly clearly in our previous session. The following passage states that, as I mentioned just now, we will still be teaching the Vimalakirti Sutra tomorrow. Regarding the classic of filial piety, the day after tomorrow, I will announce that tomorrow. We shall see whether the classic of filial piety will be taught on that day. Let me emphasize this important matter to everyone once more. Otherwise, even if I state it once or twice, some people might still be unaware. They were likely daydreaming at that particular moment, distracted by other tasks because their minds were elsewhere. If your mind was indeed elsewhere just now, let me notify everyone once again. Otherwise, some of you might end up breaking the lineage transmission when it matters. A class will have been missed. That would not be ideal at all. As I mentioned a few days ago, one person here who is about to be appointed as a Khenpo has not missed a single class in 19 years. However, for many of you attending classes here, I think for some, let alone 19 years, even going 19 days without missing a single class is actually quite difficult for those living in the cities. People at Laronga generally perform better. Nevertheless, for people elsewhere, and even for those at Laronga, it is hard to say. For some, I do not see them at all throughout the entire year. They certainly have not been listening to the teachings in my estimation. Generally speaking, they are likely absent. If I have not seen them even once in 360 days, they have perhaps not been listening. I hope that those at Larunga, whether monastics or lay practitioners who do not engage in study, contemplation, and practice, had best not stay here. Otherwise, there is really nothing for you to do here. If you are here merely to work, or if you are here trying to earn money, there are other ways to achieve that. Furthermore, I have heard that some lay practitioners here spend every day grooming themselves instead of studying, spending all their time decorating and fixing up their rooms. I have heard that a very small number of people do this. Such reports have even appeared in some of the news. Whether these reports are true, I do not know. The same applies to some monastics as well. For those who behave like that throughout the entire year, if you are going through an especially difficult period, occasionally appearing once when you feel better is acceptable. However, for those who have not appeared once in 360 days, because in the present time we could actually set things up in the future so that if you happen to miss a single class, we can track it completely through the computer. If you skip a class, a red line will simply stay there and it will never disappear until the teaching of this Dharma is completed. We are planning to implement such a system in the future. Every person would need to operate through the computer. There would be no need for individuals to report their attendance in person each time you attend a class. Even if you are there in person, you would need to confirm your presence on a computer or phone. Otherwise, when the time comes, of course, some people might come in and sign in for attendance and then simply go back to sleep. This is a possibility. People are quite clever these days, are they not? However, we can set up the system to monitor participation from the very beginning until the end. But first, let us continue with the teaching. Perhaps I have been speaking too quickly. The following passage describes the Buddha telling Bodhisattva jewel accumulation. According to his sincerity, does the Bodhisattva generate his practice. This means what we discussed earlier, having a mind free from flattery and deceit and profound, firm faith. In this case, the Bodhisattva is able to give rise to genuine aspiration in actual conduct. Once such an aspiration is generated, his actions will also be virtuous actions. As a teaching of His Holiness, Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche states, the profound and vast Dharma of all Buddhas of the 10 directions and 3 times is ultimately summed up in a kind heart and virtuous conduct. I ask those with the affinity for this to practice it earnestly. When it is convenient, I will post this teaching on my Tibetan Weibo account. This is very important. Therefore, regarding the mind and one's actions, if there is a pure aspiration, his conduct will naturally be virtuous. In accordance with such aspiration and virtuous conduct, one can then attain a deep mind. The deep mind, as we discussed earlier, is a steadfast mind of the path. It is a mind that will not regress. Then, in accordance with such a firm mind of the path, one can tame the mind. In order to guide and transform beings, one must tame and subdue the greed, anger, and delusion within their mind stream. This involves turning away from evil toward virtue or abandoning evil and practicing virtue. It means cutting off non-virtuous conduct and engaging in the virtuous Dharma. This process is what we call taming the mind. If your mind is steadfast and you can truly tame it, then following this taming of one's own mind. Because the mind is tamed, what was difficult becomes possible. Even the most challenging tasks can be accomplished. With that attained, you can then practice in conformity with the teaching. One can practice in accordance with the instructions of the Buddha and spiritual teachers. In other words, one can follow and practice the teachings regarding according to his practice in conformance to the teaching. If one practices according to the instructions of the Buddha and spiritual teachers, then one is able to rededicate. If one practices and acts in accordance with the Buddha's instructions, then being sustained by Mahayana bodhicitta, one can carry out all kinds of actions that bring benefit to sentient beings. Subsequently, you can dedicate such wholesome roots to sentient beings, wishing for them to attain supreme awakening. Being fully capable of practicing this represents being able to dedicate. The preceding section, according to Master Kuiji's interpretation, primarily outlines a sequential practice for cultivating the mind, from the sincerity mind to the act of dedication. This means, as we discussed previously, beginning with basic character, then generating Mahayana bodhicitta, and finally dedicating all merit to all sentient beings. This process represents the most excellent and noble state of mind in this world. What follows next is discussed from the perspective of the resultant Dharma, stretching from according to his rededication to the very end. The virtuous Dharma we practice is explained here in terms of its results. According to his rededication, he attains expedient means. If we practice dedication, we will possess skillful means. If we utilize the Mahayana three supreme methods of dedication, then skillful means will certainly be present. With skillful means, one will not fall back into the three realms of existence. Furthermore, according to the teachings of Master Kumarajiva, there are three distinct kinds of skillful means. The first is the skillful means of personally practicing virtue, generating bodhicitta, while personally practicing the virtuous Dharma. The second is the skillful means of not grasping at realization, refraining from grasping at the realization of the Shravaka or Pratyeka Buddha Arhats. The third is the skillful means of guiding and transforming beings. This means that while you practice, you simultaneously guide and transform others. For most of us, skillful means primarily concerns taming and transforming sentient beings. This is the most skillful and essential quality of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. When we benefit sentient beings in the future, we must also rely on these skillful methods. In accordance with skillful means, one can mature sentient beings, as we just discussed, by using skillful means, such as regularly teaching them the Dharma and guiding them through the practice of the 6 paramitas. What does this achieve? This is known as the maturing of sentient beings. When sentient beings are thus matured, the Buddha land is thereby purified. In our previous session, we also discussed this point. When a Buddha or Bodhisattva wishes to establish their own land, upon what does that depend? It depends entirely on the state of their sentient beings. If the mind streams of sentient beings are purified, then that Buddha land will certainly be pure as well. In accordance with the purity of the Buddha land, the teaching of the Dharma is pure. If the Buddha land itself is pure, then the minds of the beings within that land are also pure. When their minds are pure, they will not engage in idle gossip or scattered speech, nor will they display any cunning or deceitful behavior. Consequently, the Dharma is thereby purified. The teaching of the Dharma becomes pure. If the teaching of the Dharma is pure, then wisdom is pure. If the Dharma being taught is free from defilement and free from the 8 worldly concerns, then the wisdom that each sentient being receives, such as the wisdom of non-self, impermanence, and emptiness, is thereby purified. If wisdom is thereby pure, then ultimately our minds will certainly be pure. In reality, the source of wisdom is the mind itself. If wisdom is pure, then all minds will naturally be pure. If the mind is pure, all virtues are pure. The latter part in the Tang Dynasty translation has several differences, and some additional points were included. For instance, when wondrous wisdom is pure, wondrous knowing is pure. When wondrous knowing is pure, wondrous conduct is pure. There appear to be some slight variations there. As for the Tibetan text, it is quite similar to Kumarajiva's translation. Thus it states here, if the mind is pure, all virtues are pure. If the mind is pure, then all the virtues one has accumulated, whether mundane or supramundane, and whether of wisdom or merit, all these virtues will certainly be purified. This is because all virtues depend upon the mind. If our mind is completely purified, then conversely, the Buddha land will also be pure. As the Avatamsaka Sutra says, sentient beings see the pure land because their minds are pure. When our minds are pure, then because of that purity, no matter where we find ourselves, the Buddha land we perceive will certainly be pure. Therefore, the text states that all virtues will be pure. Consequently, the Buddha tells Bodhisattva jewel accumulation. If a Bodhisattva wishes to attain a pure land, he should purify his mind. According to the purity of his mind, is his Buddha land pure. Everyone should memorize this line. It is the central theme of this entire section on how a pure mind purifies the land, wishes to attain a pure land. For a bodhisattva who wishes to attain a pure land, their mind must first be purified. This means that as the mind becomes pure, the Buddha land itself becomes pure. In our secular world, even those without religious faith often say, a pure mind purifies the land. In fact, the origin of that saying is right here. The source for the concept that a pure mind purifies the land is found in this text. Many people in the world, including those without faith or spiritual practice, often speak these words. However, those who truly understand the profound meaning of a pure mind purifies the land are still very few in number. In teaching the Vimalakirti Sutra, I personally believe that the most vital aspect involves the primordial purity found in Tantra, such as Dzogchen and Mahamudra. If you have even a modest grounding in these principles, or if you have practiced them yourself, then the teaching of a pure mind purifies the land can be explained much more thoroughly. If you do not understand the principles of Tantra at all, and you attempt to explain a pure mind purifies the land, then perhaps for this specific chapter, which is the first chapter, the chapter on the purity of the Buddha land, your explanation might lack significant depth. Regarding this point, as you conduct your own research in the future and throughout your studies, you should observe this very carefully. For example, in the Guhya Garbha Tantra, it speaks of everything being pure. The 5 Vajra aggregates are referred to as the 5 Buddhas. We have cited this from the Guhya Garbha Tantra many times before. This means that the 5 aggregates, which are form, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness, these 5 aggregates are identical to the 5 Buddhas. The 5 Buddhas of the cardinal directions and the center are our own 5 aggregates. Our own 5 grade elements, namely earth, water, fire, wind, and space. These 5 elements are the 5 Buddha mothers. Such teachings are expounded extensively in the Guhya Garbha Tantra. They are described in great detail. Great masters like omniscient Longchenpa and the teachings of Rongdonpa and Rongzom Pandita explain each of these points with extreme clarity. From there, we will naturally come to understand very clearly this principle that the 5 aggregates are truly the 5 Buddhas. At that point, understanding a pure mind purifies the land becomes very easy. Even in the Platform Sutra of the 6th Patriarch, within the exoteric tradition, it is also stated that afflictions are a limb of awakening. Afflictions are Vajra relics. Afflictions are identical to wisdom. These things are taught, but the reality is truly found within the Tantric teachings, especially in the primordial purity of Dzogchen. Works like the Treasury of the Dharmadhatu, various other pith instructions for practice, or the specific teachings of the Panditas found in the 7 treasuries and the 17 major tantras explain this in a very detailed manner. Furthermore, this is not merely a figure of speech. These teachings use practical pith instructions to help you truly recognize the principle that afflictions are awakening and the principle that a pure mind purifies the land. Therefore, I believe that if we want to explain these genuine principles with absolute clarity, one must have an understanding of the tantric teachings. Otherwise, if we rely solely on a single exoteric scripture or treatise to explain them, we might encounter certain difficulties. Of course, I am not saying there is no information available. In fact, you can refer to existing resources, as there are currently many teachings on the Vimalakirti Sutra being given in various places. There are also numerous commentaries on the Vimalakirti Sutra. All of these exist for your use. Since they are available, you should analyze them yourself. In the course of your analysis, remember, if one wishes to attain a pure land, one must first purify the mind. When the mind is pure, one can truly attain the purity of the Buddha land. These principles have been observed throughout our daily lives and history. There are many instances of what can be perceived when the mind is purified. Everything appearing before us is essentially pure. This can also be seen on the level of conventional truth. For example, when we visited Mount Wutai in 1987, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche said at that time, everyone who makes a pilgrimage to Mount Wutai will be able to see Manjushri Bodhisattva. During that period, I also translated many various works, including prophecies from Tibetan texts, as well as some Chinese sources. It indeed seems that Manjushri Bodhisattva pledged to be present there. However, Manjushri appears in many different forms. Sometimes he appears in the form of a beggar. At other times, he may appear in the form of a farmer. The first time I traveled to Chengdu and visited Dujiangyan, when we saw the farmers working in the rice paddies, I kept thinking, that person must certainly be Manjushri Bodhisattva. I still feel this way even now. The initial faith one feels has an incredibly strong guiding power. Even now, when I return from Mount Wutai, I often see someone and think to myself, that farmer over there must be Manjushri. Our minds were very pure then as we went there on pilgrimage. In reality, for ordinary beings like us, such experiences arise only occasionally. However, you can truly look at it from this perspective. This type of practice means that when our mind is purified, the objects we encounter are also perceived as pure. If we do not maintain this purity of mind, it is highly possible that even if we are facing Manjushri Bodhisattva, we will still fail to recognize him. Consider the story of Manjushri and the Hair Stupa. Back in the Northern Wei dynasty, in a certain monastery, I believe I have shared this story once before. There was a grand feast offering held in that monastery. During the third month, a specific day was set aside for the feast. At that time, everyone who came to the monastery would be offered a free vegetarian meal. On one such occasion, there was a poor woman. She arrived carrying one baby in her arms with another child walking beside her, and she was also accompanied by a dog. Upon her arrival, she said, "I am very poor and have nothing to offer. I can only offer some of my own hair as a contribution." For people in ancient times, hair was considered very significant. She handed her hair to the guest-receiving monk. The monk was quite pleased at first. He gave a portion of food to her and then to each of the two children. She had even brought a dog along. According to the rules of their monastery, food was not to be given to animals, but he made an exception and gave a share to the dog too. Then the woman said, "I have a child in my womb, so I would like a portion for him as well." At this, the guest-receiving monk flew into a rage. "How can you be so unreasonable?" he shouted. "You have already received so many portions and are still not satisfied." He then began to scold her harshly. While he was scolding her, she suddenly rose up and hovered in the air. As she reached the sky, the woman who had just been there transformed into Manjushri Bodhisattva. The dog transformed into a magnificent lion. The Bodhisattva then sat upon that lion. The two children transformed into two young attendants, standing ready to serve in front and behind. The guest-receiving monk was instantly filled with deep remorse and sorrow. Then a voice rang out from the heavens. The records of Mount Qingliang say, "Sentient beings should practice equality. Do not let the mind be swayed by the waves of external circumstances. Sentient beings should learn the principle of equality and avoid being moved by outer conditions. When the 100 limbs of the body are all relinquished, how can hatred or love remain? Once this physical body is given up, we see it is entirely impermanent. Therefore, there is no need for attachment or aversion." The message was that there was no need to be so miserly. A single bowl of food is of no great consequence. One should not act with such small-mindedness. It was said that these words were later carved onto a stone at the site. However, my memory of that specific detail is not very clear. When we visited that location, I had actually known this story well before my trip to Mount Wutai. Once I arrived, I went around asking people about it everywhere. After inquiring for some time, well, as I have mentioned in previous teachings, while I was circumambulating the Dharma Stupa, I tried to recite the Manjushri praise and the Dzogchen aspiration prayer. I had never been able to memorize them before that moment, but as I continued walking, I suddenly found that I could recite them by heart. I personally believe this was a blessing from Manjushri Bodhisattva. Perhaps my recitation was not entirely perfect, perfect, but regardless, these kinds of experiences do happen sometimes. Later on, that guest-receiving monk placed the hair inside a hair stupa to serve as a relic stupa. There is a very small stupa standing beside Taiwan Monastery today. In the past, there was a toilet located right next to it. That was certainly not an ideal arrangement. However, I am not sure if it is still there now. I did not see it during my last visit. Is it still there? It is still there, isn't it? In the future, this site should be respected. In fact, this hair stupa carries immense blessings. So it is quite possible that in our actual lives, we do not always recognize the various manifestations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We may not see their true nature. But within our present world, as mentioned in the commentary on the aspiration of Sukhavati, there was once a great accomplished master. But I have spoken about this before, so I will skip that story for now. Regarding this principle of a pure mind purifies the land, back in July of 2011, the Chinese University of Hong Kong invited me to give a lecture. They specifically requested that I speak on a pure mind purifies the land. I provided them with a general overview of the text's contents. They might have been approaching the topic from a different angle, perhaps from an academic or theoretical level. However, when we explain this principle of a pure mind purifying the land from the perspective of a spiritual practitioner, it is indeed profoundly helpful for our actual practice. We often talk about maintaining pure perception. Pure perception does not mean that something is originally impure and you are forcing yourself to imagine it as pure. That would merely be a false projection. In Mipham Rinpoche's Beacon of Certainty, it is stated that if you consider something to be pure when it is not originally so, it would be like looking at a jar filled with impure filth and trying to visualize it as clean. Reality is not like that. When we practice pure perception, whether we look at it from the level of the Tathagatagarbha in all beings or from the level of the four great elements of the physical body, all can be realized as inherently pure, all can be described as pure. Therefore, when the principle of a pure mind purifies the land is integrated with practice, it becomes extremely meaningful. I also hope that all of you here will remain grounded and diligent in your studies. You must truly understand the principle that a pure mind purifies the land. This is not something to just talk about from scriptures and treatises. In reality, one should realize, so it truly is this way. When we began studying the first chapter of the Guhyagarbha Tantra and Mipham Rinpoche's commentary, the Guhyagarbha Tantra Luminous Essence, we all felt a profound resonance with the principle of primordial purity. I believe everyone who has studied the general meaning of the Guhyagarbha Tantra has gained a deep understanding of primordial purity. Especially for those in our Tantra class, many of you should have already reached a firm certainty in this regard. After the Buddha had finished teaching these principles, Sariputra, influenced by the Buddha's spiritual power, gave rise to a certain discriminating thought. What kind of thought was it? He thought, if a bodhisattva's pure mind leads to a pure Buddha land, then back when our great teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, was a bodhisattva, that is to say, during his causal stage of practice, was his mind perhaps not entirely pure? He wondered this because our present world appears so impure. It is described as a world of 5 turbidities filled with so much filth and disorder. Even today, sanitation in many parts of India is not very good. Many aspects of the environment there are still quite challenging. So at that moment, Sariputra was thinking to himself, if a pure mind is what purifies a land, then I understand. Perhaps the Buddha's mind was not perfectly pure during his causal stage, and that is why this world we live in is so defiled. The Buddha immediately knew what Sariputra was thinking. The Buddha then addressed him directly, saying, "Why do you hold such a view? If a blind person is unable to see the sun and the moon, is it the fault of the sun and moon? Are they somehow impure? Do you believe the problem lies with the blind person, or is it the fault of the sun and the moon themselves?" The question could be framed in that way. The Buddha used this metaphor to instruct Sariputra. If a blind person cannot perceive the sun and the moon, is it due to the blind person's own condition, or is it because of the sun and the moon? Regarding the sun and the moon, the Chinese language has something very interesting, the term ri yue. The character for bright is composed of both the sun and the moon. I sometimes use this character Ming. I have used it in many contexts before. This was more than 20 years ago, around 1997, when I used it quite frequently. There was another word before it, but I should not mention that one. But later it seemed the auspicious signs of this character were better. One reason is that our symbol has a connection with the sun and the moon. There are other reasons as well. So this character Ming, this specific Chinese character, has a wonderful form even in its ancient oracle bone script. I have always had a particular fondness for the character Ming. Westerners might also find this quite interesting if they look into it. So, why was the blind person unable to see? What was the true reason? Sariputra then replied to the Buddha, "It is not like that, world-honored one. It is actually the fault of the blind person themselves. It is not because of any issue with the sun or the moon. They are not in error. The sun and moon remain in the sky, but because the blind person lacks the faculty of sight, he simply cannot see them." At this point, the Buddha told Sariputra, "Exactly, it is the same principle here. Due to the karmic obscurations of sentient beings, they are unable to see the Tathagata's pure and magnificent Buddha land. The fact that they cannot see this magnificent and pure land is not the fault of the Tathagata." The Buddha further said to Sariputra, "My Buddha land has always been pure, just like this. However, you have consistently failed to perceive it." Because Sariputra had just been thinking that perhaps Shakyamuni Buddha's aspirations during his causal stage were impure, he assumed that was the reason. Then the Buddha told him, "My Buddha land is indeed pure. It is only that you are unable to see it yourself. As a Shravaka practitioner, you are much like that blind person. Because you lack the wisdom eye, you cannot perceive the true nature of this world." At that very moment, while the Buddha and Sariputra were engaged in this dialogue and debate, a Brahma king named Sikhin arrived at the scene. Brahma King Sikhin was likely one of the celestial kings attending the assembly. Regarding the term Sikhin, in our previous study of the luminous essence of the Guhya Garbha Tantra, we translated it as Brahma with a top knot. He is the Brahma adorned with a top knot. In Master Xuanzang's version, the term used is Chiji, or holding a top knot. Chi means to hold. Holding a top knot is also a valid translation. It simply refers to someone adorned with a top knot. In this text, he is Brahma King Sikhin, the Brahma king with a conch shell top knot. In Jichen's version, he is described as a Brahmin with braided hair. The term Fanzi generally refers to a Brahmana. There are ancient stories which say that Brahmanas were born from the mouth of Brahma. In traditional Indian folklore, such descriptions can be found as well. So we commonly refer to Brahmanas as Brahmins. Each of the 4 great castes of India has its own unique origin story. There are various versions of these accounts. Most versions are fairly consistent. Regarding Brahma King Sikhin in this context, some commentators explain that his top knot was shaped specifically like a conch shell. The English translation seems to reflect this as well. It refers to a top knot that looks like a conch shell. This Brahma king possessed such a top knot. In any case, this Brahma king came from another Buddha land or another world. Perhaps calling it another planet sounds a bit strange, as if I am talking about an extraterrestrial. Let us just say he came from another world. This was Brahma King Sikhin, who had traveled from a different world. In Tibetan, he is called Rabjagyen, which means the Brahma adorned with a top knot. The term used in the Tibetan text is simply Brahma. In the versions by Kumarajiva and Xuanzang, it is translated as Brahma King. Both Brahma and Brahma King are acceptable terms. In this context, we can use either Brahma or Brahma King. At that moment, he spoke the following words. He directly addressed Sariputra, saying, "Do not harbor such thoughts. Do not think that this Buddha land is impure." The Tibetan version says, "Do not say it." However, "do not think it" is also an appropriate translation. He was referring to the so-called impurity of this land. He was told not to think it and not to say it, both the thought and the word. Do not think that the land of Shakyamuni Buddha is somehow impure. "Do not speak such words." In reality, Sariputra had not only thought it, but he had already expressed it. It might have been better if he had kept it to himself. If the instruction is, "Do not say it," then he has certainly already thought it. If it only says, "Do not think it," it implies he has not yet spoken. Thus there is a slight nuance in the different translations. However, we do not need to be overly concerned with the specific wording. The great masters of the past each had their own unique translation styles. This specific passage also appears in the luminous essence of the Guhyagarbha Tantra. At that time, Mipham Rinpoche established the view of purity by utilizing both scriptural and logical citations. In the section concerning scriptural evidence, he cited the evidence found in this very sutra. Although the focus was on the luminous essence of the Guhyagarbha Tantra, what sources did that treatise rely upon? It actually utilized an exoteric scripture. Similarly, in our study of the general meaning of the Guhyagarbha Tantra, many exoteric scriptures are used to provide support. This includes the sections that follow, where many scriptural citations from the Vimalakirti Sutra have been integrated. This point is very important. Many Buddhists today believe that certain views within the Tantric tradition conflict with exoteric teachings. Is such a view reasonable or well-founded? If you understand both the exoteric and the Tantric traditions, you will see that to explain the exoteric essentials, one must also include the Tantric. If the Tantric scriptures were not available, some exoteric scriptures would be extremely difficult to explain clearly. For example, consider the teaching, "Afflictions are awakening." This phrase appears in many exoteric scriptures, but how exactly are afflictions equivalent to awakening? Which specific afflictions are we referring to? How can desire become awakening? How can anger or delusion become awakening? According to the exoteric scriptures themselves, all of these must be abandoned. They are to be abandoned at the path of seeing and the path of meditation. If they must be abandoned, how can they simultaneously be awakening? If they truly are awakening, does that mean what we abandon at the path of seeing is itself awakening, or what we abandon at the path of meditation is awakening? Many such complex questions arise. Therefore, there is no need for any of us here to feel aversion toward these teachings. I am not saying this merely because I study Tantra, nor out of fear that people will criticize me. That is not the case. However, if you truly wish to understand the deep principles of Buddhism, you must engage in listening, contemplating, and studying. You should compare the doctrines of the exoteric tradition with those of the Tantric. While some points can be explained within the exoteric tradition itself, others absolutely require the interpretive methods of the Tantric teachings in order to be explained with complete clarity. Unfortunately, some people today do not study the scriptures at all. Instead, they speak carelessly and frequently slander the teachings. They are constantly evaluating and criticizing without understanding. This is not a healthy or helpful approach. In my view, if you are to be a sincere Buddhist, you should study the exoteric and Tantric scriptures and treatises systematically. Otherwise, some believe that merely taking refuge is enough. In truth, that is insufficient for deep understanding. For example, if a person wants to learn English, think about the process of learning it. If you only attend a single class, can you master the rules of the language? The same principle applies to learning Japanese or French. If you attend only 1 or 2 classes, or if you have only a vague idea of what Japanese is, will you be able to actually apply it in practice? It is a vast and complex linguistic system. If you truly want to master it, at the very least, no matter how much natural talent you possess, you would need to study for 5 or 6 years before you could use it effectively. I believe Buddhism works exactly the same way. If you want to truly become a Buddhist, you need to engage in systematic study for at least 4 or 5 years. Even if you do not want to be a Buddhist, but you wish to negate certain principles within the exoteric tradition or specific doctrines within the Tantric teachings, I still believe you must study them for at least 5 to 10 years. Only then would you have the standing to negate their views. Otherwise, your criticisms are like arrows shot in the dark. The arrows you shoot are not aimed at any real target at all. You're missing the point entirely. There is a specific metaphor used in Tibetan. It is like shooting an arrow blindly. If you are merely shooting into the open air, no one will take your effort seriously. Such a person is not an expert at all. If someone understands nothing of Tantra, just let them speak. Let them talk. It does not matter, for their words carry no weight. No one who understands reason will accept such claims. It is exactly like shooting an arrow into the void. There is no target to hit, so no one is concerned. Now, returning to what the text describes, where was I in the passage? Brahma King Sikhin said to Sariputra, "Do not harbor such thoughts and do not speak such words. Do not say that Shakyamuni Buddha's land is impure. Why is that? Because I have personally seen that the Buddha's land is pure. It is identical to the palace of the sovereign celestial king. This is what I have witnessed with my own eyes. You cannot deny what has been directly observed. In terms of valid cognition, this is direct perception. However, Sariputra had not seen it this way. Shakyamuni Buddha had already declared his land to be pure. Then Brahma King Sikhin also stepped forward to testify, "I have personally seen this world as pure, resembling the palace of the sovereign celestial king." Regarding the celestial palace, the Tibetan text identifies it as Paranirmitavasavartin. Why use this specific heaven as a metaphor? According to the explanations of Master Kuiji, it represents the most perfect state of enjoyment in the desire realm. It is a world of supreme abundance, although this heaven is still part of the conditioned realm and is often described as the dwelling place of Mara Papian. It is actually the highest station within our desire realm. If we are using a metaphor to illustrate the point, this is the most fitting one, following Master Kuiji's reasoning. I find this explanation to be very sound, since it is like the palace of the sovereign celestial king. Its enjoyments are incredibly perfect and complete, manifesting directly through the power of miraculous transformation. It is similar to the state of Sukhavati. Therefore, the world of Shakyamuni Buddha is actually like the palace of Paranirmitavasavartin. It is filled with perfect enjoyment and is completely pure. At that very moment, Sariputra spoke up. As I look upon this Buddha land, Sariputra was still unwilling to admit its purity. He said, "No, the land I see before me is filled with hillocks, abysses, thorns, brambles, and gravel. It is covered with rocky mountains, foul and unbearable, overflowing with filth and evil." This is exactly what we see today. Sometimes we see only dust or hillocks and thorns. Regarding thorns and brambles, in both Chinese and English, these two characters can be explained separately. In our Tibetan language, we use the term tsema. Only a tree with actual sharp points is called a thorn bush. However, it seems that in the Chinese language, one refers to thorns while the other does not. I am not entirely sure how the translators dealt with this nuance. The same applies to the word gravel. Sand refers to small grains. Gravel refers to small pebbles and fragments of stone. These terms can also be differentiated in certain texts. In any case, the world as we perceive it is full of filth and disorder. It is dirty, chaotic, and poor. This includes the appearance of the mountains. The text mentions mountains and hillocks and plains. I remember quite clearly when we studied geography in the past. Learning geography back then was actually quite interesting. At the time, I was just a child growing up in the mountains. We had no televisions and certainly none of the phones we have today. We had nothing at all. We only had what the teacher told us. The teacher would describe the great plains of the world to us. They spoke of basins such as the Sichuan Basin and the vast deserts of Xinjiang. They taught us about Oceania, New Zealand, and Australia. When I eventually traveled to those places, I recalled those lessons with incredible clarity. I remember that geography teacher back in middle school. At that time, we were still very innocent and naive. We were just children from the mountains. When the teacher would explain these things, it sometimes sounded like a fairy tale to us. In our mountain home, there was no such thing as the great ocean. We wondered what an ocean could possibly look like, plains and deserts that were immensely, immensely vast, and we heard there was an animal called a camel. For us in those days, we could not see much in films either. As for films, occasionally there were screenings like Landmine Warfare or a few movies from Yugoslavia like The Bridge, but such opportunities were extremely rare. Basically, when I was in middle school, we had nothing. Back then, the world was very limited. Our perception was limited to the world in our eyes. It was only as far as we could actually see. So sometimes when hillocks were mentioned in class, the geography teacher we had at the time would draw a simple rounded mound on the blackboard. I would wonder, can such mountains actually exist? Because all the mountains where we live have sharp, pointed peaks. The teacher then drew the Alps and the Rocky Mountains, referring to those mountain ranges located in present-day North and South America. He explained how these mountain ranges extend along their courses and where all the water in the world comes from. He told us the ocean is boundless and vast, and that there are even countries situated in the middle of those oceans. Now, looking back at places like Australia and New Zealand, we see they are surrounded by such a high percentage of water, yet within those vast oceans nations still exist. On the land of those countries there are still cattle and sheep. At that time we would wonder, why do these countries not sink into the sea? So, during those years, this sense of filth and disorder eventually transformed. In truth, children from the mountains have very simple and pure hearts. What we found most fascinating back then was geography. We also had to study hard in those days. Although we often snuck peeks at our notes, our performance was still not very good. The following passage then speaks of exams, referring to how testing was conducted back then. It seems many schools today still operate in a similar way. It was not a very ideal situation. The teachers back then, although we did not have the standardized exams we see today, it seemed that teachers would sometimes deliberately teach children how to sneak peeks at answers. Some teachers in those classes, in a way that might be considered quite shameful in modern cities or within some Western educational systems. This happened because the teachers themselves were acting for their salaries and benefits. They had various motivations. It was not at all like the environment we have today, but there were also special requirements from the geography teacher, as well as special requirements from the history teacher. Now we shall begin the next section in accordance with the intent of the spiritual teacher. The following text explains the experience of seeing this world as foul and unbearable. Indeed, that was the perception. Then Brahma King Sikhin said to him, "Venerable Sariputra, your mind harbors a sense of high and low. When the mind discriminates between high and low, the world cannot appear pure. Whether a world is pure or impure depends primarily on our own minds. For Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, their state of mind is still limited. For Bodhisattvas and Buddhas, the state of mind is exceptionally high. By maintaining a mind of discrimination and not relying on the Buddha's wisdom, one therefore perceives this world as impure." Brahma King Sikhin is truly a formidable and great bodhisattva. Some commentaries state that he is a great being of the Dharma body. He is a truly remarkable celestial being. Addressing the view that this Buddha land is impure, he then told Sariputra, "A bodhisattva toward all sentient beings is originally equal in their inherent nature. If one's profound mind is purified, if through practice our profound mind reaches purity, and if we rely on the Buddha's wisdom, one can then see that this Buddha land is pure. If we truly rely on the Buddha's wisdom to observe it, it is indeed pure." As stated in the Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment, which is a very definitive and important scripture, the lands of sentient beings share one Dharma nature. Hells and heavenly palaces are all pure lands. I have quoted this somewhere before, though I cannot recall exactly where. The lands of sentient beings share one Dharma nature. Hells and heavenly palaces are all pure lands. Both sentient beings and the land itself exist within the nature of the Dharma Dhatu. In that case, hell and heaven are actually no different from what we call a pure land. Therefore, by relying on the wisdom of the Buddha, one can see this Buddha land as pure. This was Brahma King Sikhin pointing the way and guiding Sariputra. And so the Buddha, relying on his majestic spiritual power, caused sentient beings to temporarily abide in the purity of mind, allowing them to see this land as pure. The Buddha then pressed the great earth with his toe, At that moment, the entire trichiliocosm was completely transformed into purity, adorned with hundreds of thousands of various precious substances. Now, it was said that this was just like a certain Buddha. What was his name? It was Ratnavyuha Buddha, known as Jeweled Adornment Buddha. Jeweled Adornment Buddha is a Buddha whose land is supremely pure. His land is one adorned with immeasurable virtuous precious substances. This world became just like his Buddha land. That is to say, it became identical to the virtuous adornment of Ratnavyuha Buddha's land. The Saha world was seen in this magnificent way. Of course, this passage is slightly different in some other translations. For instance, in the translation by Ji Qian from the Wu Kingdom, this particular metaphor is not very prominent. It simply states a Buddha land adorned with various precious substances. In this version, another Tathagata's land is used as a metaphor. It says it was like Sukhavati, the land of bliss. However, returning to Ji Qian's translation, he states directly that it was adorned with various precious substances. The overall meaning remains the same. So there are some slight variations across certain translations. This means that by relying on the Buddha's majestic spiritual power, the minds of all sentient beings were allowed to be purified. At that point, they were fully able to perceive that the land of our Saha world became entirely identical to the land of Ratnavyuha Tathagata. At that moment, the entire Great Assembly exclaimed in amazement at such a marvel. Everyone in the assembly was deeply moved and amazed, finding it exceedingly rare and wonderful. Furthermore, regarding their own state, they each saw themselves seated upon a glorious and precious lotus pedestal. Immediately their afflictions were completely purified. Everyone present experienced this sublime state of realization. This kind of experience is not only recorded in this specific sutra. If you examine the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, when the Buddha was about to teach that great Nirvana Sutra, the entire trichiliocosm described in that scripture was also transformed. Through the majestic spiritual power of the Buddha, everything turned into a realm of glorious purity. Resembling the land of bliss known as Sukhavati, such passages also exist. At special moments, the Buddha would confer his blessings, causing the minds of beings to abide in this pure and pristine state. In that moment, when they see truly and accurately, what can they perceive? They can perceive the essential purity of the entire world. Then at that moment, the Buddha told Sariputra, "Look now, do you see that this Buddha land is pure?" Sariputra then replied to him, "Yes, it is indeed so, world-honored one. This land has always been pure by its very nature. However, previously I had neither seen it nor heard of it. Today, only by relying on the Buddha's spiritual power have I truly seen it. Therefore, the state of the mind is truly the most crucial factor of all. As you see, even Sariputra has now acknowledged this truth. Regarding this story, I hope that all of us here I have heard that for each chapter we have a certain procedure. I am not sure if there are sign-ups today for the exam. Is that right? The oral examination will be given shortly. If so, I hope you will take everything discussed today, including the dialogue, and contemplate it again and again. You have only listened to one class session so far. One class lasts at most for 1 hour. If you listen for only an hour, it is certain that the content cannot be fully absorbed. You must study and research it many more times. Even if you are only in your 20s today, when you reach your 40s or even 60s, you should still be reflecting on this profound principle. Only then will you truly understand how a pure mind purifies the land. Regarding these profound principles, do not think that a single encounter is enough, as if you were just watching a movie or reading a novel. You cannot say, "I have read Dream of the Red Chamber once, so that is enough," or think, "I have finished Romance of the Three Kingdoms and I am done." In Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it is merely a certain plot or event. However, this kind of Dharma principle is fundamentally different. I hope everyone will contemplate it with great seriousness. In the following passage, the Buddha tells Sariputra, "My Buddha land is always pure, exactly like this. It is only that you have not been able to see it." This particular line is very important. My Buddha land is always pure in this way. It is only for the sake of those beings of lower capacity that the appearance of a dirty and impure land is manifested. For instance, A metaphor is provided here. It is like the precious vessel shared by celestial beings, the very vessel they use for eating. In accordance with the differing merit of each celestial being, the color of the food they receive will also vary. For these celestial beings, it is a communal meal served from a single precious vessel resembling a great cauldron. The food within appears through the power of their meditation and merit. When it appears, each celestial being reaches in with their hand. When the food is received in each person's hand, because of their differing levels of merit, there are many variations in terms of color. Regarding the ambrosia of the celestial beings, that ambrosia is originally supremely pure. Even what is called amrita in Tibetan, when it reaches each person's hand, it appears differently. This is because the merits of sentient beings are different. The Sutra of Mind Ground states, because the mind is pure, the world is pure. Because the mind is defiled, the world is defiled. It is truly exactly like this. Sometimes, imagine 10 Dharma friends going out to eat together. During that meal, 3 of the friends have an impure mind, while the other 7 have a pure mind. Even though the food is prepared by the same restaurant, the 3 friends might say, "Wow, it is especially awful today. I feel like gagging, and I really do not want to eat it." But the other 7 will say, "Wow, it is absolutely delicious." It is just like the ambrosia of the celestials. In my entire life, I have never tasted such a delicious meal before. There may be many such differing karmic perceptions. In truth, there are very many things in this world that follow this principle, including among human beings. Some consider a thing beautiful, while others consider it unattractive. Some consider certain food delicious, whereas others find it unpleasant. This applies to many things that we perceive. I have noticed, for instance, a flower called the Hoya, which is a kind of flower that comes in various colors. Some people might say, "This is especially fragrant at home. It is truly wonderful." But others say, "This is especially foul-smelling. Do not put it there." For example, some people consider durian to be especially delicious. However, when others see this fruit placed in a room, they worry that there is something impure within the space. I heard that such people might search everywhere for the source. It is not actually filth. It turns out to be a food that many people love to eat. Truly, the power of karma is very different for everyone. This includes animals such as pigs and dogs. They consider excrement to be a wonderful delicacy, yet those with the shared karma of humans find it very unpleasant. There was once a story about this. Not so long ago, there was a video circulating online. It featured a person abroad who had once rescued an owl. Later, that owl came back to repay his kindness. However, whenever this person opened his window, the owl would fly in from the outside. It would bring him dead mouse carcasses and try to feed them to him. That person was actually quite touched by the gesture. He probably did not eat them, of course, but from the owl's perspective, dead mice are its finest delicacy and best food. But for us humans, they are foul-smelling, they are very stinking, and we are unwilling to eat them. By the same principle within our world, whether something is perceived as dirty or clean, if the mind is defiled, then the world is defiled. If the mind is pure, then the world is pure. We should gradually observe and contemplate this principle. Slowly, you will understand the inner meaning of a pure mind. Therefore, the text provides the metaphor of celestial beings. Regarding this metaphor of celestial beings, we are obviously not celestial beings ourselves. We do not know exactly what their life is like. We are not entirely clear on how their communal meals work. However, many principles within our human world are actually very easy to see and are quite clear. When visiting Larungar, one group of visitors, such as some guests I met today, will say, "Wow, what a moving experience. How fortunate and happy you all are here. I see everyone here as being very pure." Each person looks so compassionate. Then later this morning I encountered another group of people. That group of people said, "Oh, it is so hard here. It is quite frightening. The weather is just so terrible. I am so cold today that I must leave immediately. I cannot stay. If I were to stay any longer, I would surely be finished." So this quality of the world remains the same. When we go to a certain place, some find it wonderful while others do not. Some find it beautiful while others do not. Even the same person may have different experiences at different times. As for what this world is truly like, this involves a very profound principle of the secret mantra. We should reflect upon this for ourselves. Consider the story of Chan Master Fo Yin and Su Dongpo. Su Dongpo said, "I have won today. I told the Dharma master that he looked like something impure, but he said to me that I looked like a Buddha." That was what Chan Master Fo Yin said to Su Dongpo. Then Su Dongpo's sister, who had great realization, said, "Wow, you have lost today." And why is that? Because the other person's world is pure. His world is also pure. He sees you as a Buddha. His world is like a Buddha land. But because your own mind is impure, your entire world is defiled. When you see such a wonderful master as something impure, then you have failed completely. On the surface, this story seems like a simple debate in the style of Chan inquiry, but in reality it contains a genuine principle. This also applies to many of us in our evaluation of ourselves, thinking, "I am a bad person," or "I am a suffering person." This is also a kind of attitude toward oneself regarding the purity or impurity of the land. The self is also a kind of land. If we are filled with confidence and joy toward ourselves, then even if some suffering occurs, these afflictions are all seen as awakening. In this way, one's courage, bravery, and wisdom will be enhanced. But if we are filled with a pessimistic and sorrowful state of mind, the realization of a pure mind purifying the land remains distant. Then the Buddha continued speaking to Sariputra. "Thus it is, Sariputra. If a person's mind is pure, he will see the meritorious qualities and adornments of this land." When the Buddha manifested the purity of this land, the 500 elder sons led by Ratnakuta Bodhisattva all attained the tolerance of non-arising. They attained the realization of emptiness, the tolerance of non-arising of the first or eighth Bodhisattva ground. Furthermore, 84,000 people all generated the resolve for Anuttara Samyak Sambodhicitta. In our Tibetan text, there are two mentions of 84,000. I just noticed it, but this might both refer to the people present. There are two 84,000s. I do not know if other translations also have this. At that moment, the Buddha withdrew his spiritual power. The entire world was then restored to its former appearance. Master Kuiji asked, "Why did the Buddha do this?" The Buddha first purified the minds of sentient beings so that they could perceive the true nature of the world. However, this experience was only temporary. For this realization to be lasting, sentient beings must engage in their own practice. Only through personal practice can this state become stable. This is a very important point, because the Buddha was blessing those present at that time, including Sariputra and the others. Through his empowerment, their minds became temporarily pure, and they saw the true nature of this world. But this was ultimately the result of the Buddha conferring blessings to create a temporary purity of mind. If beings truly wish to reach the state where a pure mind purifies the land, each individual must reach that realization through their own cultivation. At that point, 32,000 Shravakas and celestial beings realized that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. By penetrating the impermanence of all conditioned things, they attained awakening. Sometimes, when one contemplates impermanence, if there is a karmic affinity, one can awaken immediately. They became remote from dust and separated from defilement. This means they had no further attachment to external objects, and internally they were free from the view of a self. This represents the complete severing of the 88 bonds of affliction. Finally, they attained the purity of the Dharma eye. Attaining the purity of the Dharma eye generally refers to the fruit of a stream enterer. In other words, they attained the path of seeing. Over 30,000 humans and celestial beings attained the path of seeing. Furthermore, 8,000 monks, by not grasping at any phenomena, severed all attachments to the self and what belongs to the self. All of their conditioned afflictions were completely extinguished. Thus, they attain the fruit of arhatship. Finally, upon the completion of this chapter on how a pure mind purifies the land, a vast number of sentient beings have attained liberation. Let us also take this principle of a pure mind purifying the land and regularly observe and contemplate it in our lives. This chapter is indeed profound. It is very similar to the practice of primordial purity in the tantric teachings, but due to time constraints, it is not possible to draw every correspondence one by one. I am merely offering a reminder to everyone. Within the scriptures, why do these exoteric texts speak so much of purity? Actually, there is much more to be said about this principle later on. It is just that here, purity is mainly discussed from the perspective of the Buddha land. On this point, the exoteric tradition's discussion of the pure mind contains symbolic descriptions that align with Tantra. We will conclude today's teaching here. The second chapter will begin tomorrow. Tomorrow we will begin the chapter on skillful means.
Bandara Badna Sadarda Bandara Badna Sada Bandara Badna Sadarda